Hi there, it's Zoe. My question for you this week is, how much foresight do you have when it comes to the future? Do you use a crystal ball, or are you smart and use futurist technologies? Let's find out. On Planet Human this week, a weird one. Yes, a company wants to set up a data center on the moon. They want to take advantage of the natural cycle of the moon and its coldness to help with data storage. It's lunar powered, no, sorry, it's solar powered and lunar stored. This is an avenue of commercial development I had not anticipated for the moon, but there you have it. So if you want to store your data, maybe it's going to be on the moon. That's quite an interesting little story about what else could we put on the moon to help us serve humanity. On Planet Zoe, yes, I am immersed completely in the book launch of Power Games, A Leader's Guide to Office Politics and Drama-Free Collaboration. We are entering into the second week of the Kickstarter launch as this episode is released, and I'm thrilled by the uptake of it. And you can still, I think, if this comes out on the 26th of May, you might still be able to get in before I do the spinning wheel and pull out the name, the winner for the giveaway. And I'm giving away the entire e-bundle, including the ebook, the audio book, the workbook, and the 22 worksheets that go alongside all of that. It's a really great little digital bundle. If you just promote it on the social medias and tag me in, or if you become a backer with just even $1, you can go into the running. And every backer who's already backed the campaign will get double entry into the giveaway. All right, so why is Power Games so exciting? It is because it unpacks what are the power games people play at work, everything from gaslighting to manipulation to micromanaging to gossip, you name it. We unpack what are those behaviors all about, and more importantly, what are the counter moves we can do to disable them or deal with them, if you like. We look at the four spheres of personal power and the way that we can build our own power in a positive, healthy way, and to avoid the shadow archetypes that go alongside the five main archetypes. Our slide into shadow means that we could fall prey to power games and become the power monger we never wanted to be. So we have a look at that, as well as the 5 principles for high performing teams and what we need to do across organizations to help bring transparency to our decision making and processes, and to keep weeding the garden of our culture to keep power games out of our garden. All right, so that's a little brief overview of Power Games. Do make sure you click on the link in the show notes on the Kickstarter campaign and join us. I can't wait to get this book into your hot little hands. What if we could identify our assumptions about the future? How might that change the way that we lead? I think the first thing is to identify the fact that we have assumptions. And sometimes we don't realize they are assumptions until they hit us in the face. Because we're like, oh, I assume that blah, blah, blah. And that's where we can fall prey to all sorts of issues. That's the reason why they say assumptions make an ass of you and me. So where do you start? You start by filling out the question of putting the parameters around the part of the future that you want to have a look at. Determine the boundaries around that. Otherwise, the topic gets really too massive. So, for example, I'd say, what is the future of podcasting? So I've put a little frame around that. I might say also put a time frame around it. It might be over the next 3 years. Start by identifying your assumptions. What are those? What you believe to be true. So I started listing those off. And the first assumption is people like listening. Is that true? Well, I think it's true. I have to do some digging around the truth of that. What is the evidence that shows that people like listening? And I know there is data out there that's saying podcast listenership is up, but there's probably some nuance around that. The second assumption I made is that podcasts sell books. Now, since I'm in the middle of launching Power Games, I've made an assumption that being a guest on podcasts will help sell the book. That's because other people have said it. Does that mean it's true? Well, maybe I need to look for evidence of that truth. And the third assumption is podcast length is for commutes only. Again, is that true? I don't know. I've heard other people say it. Well, what then? So these are all assumptions, things that we believe to be true. And if we just take them at face value, we'll make decisions in our business that can drive us in a particular direction. A better way is to list the assumptions and ask the question, Is this true? How do I know? How might I find out? And then if you don't have the evidence at hand for your assumption, then you can run an experiment, which is exactly what I'm going to do with this actual podcast. So I've been thinking about the future of the podcast, having completed 400 episodes over 9 years and going into our 10th. What am I going to do with this thing? Is it serving its purpose? Is it serving my purpose? Am I enjoying it as much? And the answer to that is, well, the third question is yes, I still enjoy it. I enjoy the conversation immensely with the guests. Is it serving its purpose of serving the audience? That's what I want to dig into. So I'm going to have a little bit of a reboot across June and to have a different approach to the podcast coming up through July. More on that later. And I'm taking the assumptions into experiments approach. So you get to see how this plays out live through me on the show. It's tea time in the office kitchen, and my guest today is Donna Dupont. She is a futurist. She has worked with a number of different types of organizations that is quite remarkable, including healthcare, public safety, defense, and security. And she has won awards from the Canadian Defense and Security Network for her futurist reporting and work. So she's an amazing lady. We love talking about scanning the horizon and developing future scenarios. So I hope you jump in for the ride and enjoy the show. Without further ado, here's Donna. Well, all the way from Montreal, Canada. Welcome to the show, Donna Dupont.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes. Well, I'm excited because Montreal is my old stomping ground. I spent 8 years there going through university. So we have that in common as well as the Canadianness. And thirdly, we have an obsession about the future and thinking about the future. And what I find in talking with leaders about the future is that there's a lot of trepidation, anxiety, fear, because there's so much disruption and uncertainty. So when we're talking about future planning, future strategy, how do we help leaders deal with the anxiety and stress around it all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm finding I'm in a lot of conversations these days around just that. I think the first thing is just to acknowledge that it is a very disruptive and uncertain time, and more than we've experienced in any other time. Even though coming out of a pandemic was very uncertain, it seems very different now because we're seeing a lot of shifts, geopolitical, economic, technology. And so it is very challenging for a lot of leaders to know how to manage and how to think in this time that we're in. So I guess the first thing I would probably say that's really important is to have awareness that the landscape is changing and that it can create a lot of anxiety. And that anxiety, you want to really understand what's happening internally around that, because when it goes unchecked, it can really shape our outlook towards the future. For example, if we have a mindset where we are in fear and those emotions of stress and anxiety are taking over us and our body, we may not want to take action. We may be reluctant to try new things or embrace change. And so it's really important to be aware when we're in that state. Okay, take a pause, allow yourself some space, maybe unplug a little bit, try to regulate yourself emotionally as best as you can, whether that's breathing exercises, whether that's getting out for a walk in nature, perhaps doing something that relaxes you, listen to music, something to set your nervous system at ease is very helpful. And then being able to engage and be able to observe what's happening in the system with a bit of neutrality. I say with a bit because it's hard to be fully neutral, but you want to try to just observe and you want to try to make sense of what's happening so that you can really understand those patterns of change and what it means for you or the business that you're in.
I think that's a really useful point, that being able to observe from a neutral standpoint, and as opposed to trying to make sense of it, is like, well, let's just document what is actually going on without putting an interpretation on it, first of all. And when you
That's right.
do that, that's actually helpful, because what we realize is that It's not often not the facts that send us squirrely, it's the story that we make up around the facts.
It is.
Sometimes the facts are pretty crap as well. Like, let's be honest, the wars continuing in the Middle East and in Ukraine are pretty crappy. You don't need a story around that. It's terrible.
Oh,
And but I think the next part is, and then making the stories or interpretations about possible futures is the next piece of that. So I like that. So first, calm yourself down. Don't go for chocolate and coffee and alcohol. Do something a bit more wholesome to
right.
downregulate the nervous system. And
That's
in
right.
that state, start to observe and see the patterns and events. And I think seeing the patterns can be a tricky thing. What are your tips around being able to link events and see patterns? Do you have a particular approach to that?
So, in the world of futures and foresight, there's a number of different methods to help make sense of the system. So, when you are looking at system change, oftentimes we want to look at it from a broader lens. And so typically, maybe with day-to-day traditional organizational planning, we might have a very narrow lens of how we approach operations. But when you're looking at system change, you really want to step out of your day-to-day and have that 30,000 view perspective of what's happening at the broad system level. So what that means is you're going to look at some broad patterns of changes. For example, you might be interested in the geopolitics, right? And
Yeah.
you might want to look at that from a national, regional, and global. And you might want to look at it and ask different questions of what is changing, what's falling away, what are some new issues that are emerging that we've never seen before, that we have no knowledge of, and that we can't predict? And where's the uncertainty? So these are really important questions that get at foresight because we're talking about a system that is very unstable, that's dynamic, that's changing, that's very interconnected, and very hard to predict. So you want to approach with a mindset of curiosity and asking what if questions and documenting what you're observing. If you can do this in a smaller group setting with
Mhm.
others with different perspectives, that's really helpful. And you want to look at different categories. You might want to look at geopolitics, then economics, maybe some technology, environment, social, maybe ethical issues as well. It depends. Some projects we look at a large frame and they call it, pestle frame
Mhm.
sometimes that we use. However, if you are working on a smaller project, you might just want to take your top three type of patterns and try to understand what's changing in the system. So it's more than trends, it's understanding what is new and dynamic that we've never experienced before. So what you're looking for is like signals of change, essentially.
So, Don, I want to just clarify one thing for the audience. So, when you're looking at systems change, do
Mm.
you mean we want to enact systems change, or are you talking about things are happening in our ecosystem? And I use that term broadly across the organizational ecosystem, could be environmental ecosystem. Things are changing around us as a broader, uncategorized aspect of system. So my question is, what do you mean when we're considering systems change? Is it systems change that we want to enact or that's being imposed upon us or both?
So it can be both, but
Hmm.
you can start off with understanding the broader external environment,
Hmm.
right? The broader system, internal, external environment, ecosystem.
Hmm.
And that can be at different levels, whether it's global, regional, or national or organizational. So you can really take it down depending on where you're curious and where your questions of inquiry are. But this type of thinking is really an iterative process of inquiry
Hmm.
and understanding and unpacking. So that is definitely one way to approach it, just to get an understanding of the pattern and possible evolution of some of these changes that we're seeing, because this helps you to anticipate where things may go. And this allows you to understand potential, plausible, and possible future landscapes that you might want to explore in a scenario set or other types of methods that allow for strategic conversations about the future.
All right. Well, I want to get into plausible and possible futures in just a moment. Again, coming back to brass tack piece. So, if we're getting leaders to think about their business as a system within several systems, what recommendation do you have to help them visualize that?
To visualize that, that's a good question. A lot of times we do systems thinking exercises, but it's more external.
Hmm.
But if you want to visualize your organization within a system, it's one thing you can do is this is what we do in scenarios,
Okay.
right? When we do foresight scenarios, essentially, because but we're not actually mapping it in a visual way, although you can recreate an experience, right? But what you can do with a foresight scenario is you are creating an plausible future operating environment.
Hmm.
And it can be based on insights and evolution, and you're bringing things together to provoke a strategic conversation. And what you can do is put your organization in the middle of that so that you are, in fact, stress testing how your organization would function in that environment.
Okay.
And then this will actually bring up a whole lot of dialogue, insights around what may work, what works well, what doesn't work well, where things might fall apart, maybe where we need to invest in new capabilities, new ways of doing things. This is the idea behind strategic foresight. And the reason I'm suggesting this and explaining this is simply because when you're dealing with really complex systems with so much complexity and uncertainty, it's hard to map that in the
Mm.
traditional linear approach. It doesn't, complex systems are nonlinear, they're cascading, there's a lot of interdependencies. And so you need a different type of tool that gives it in a form of this complexity in a story, in a narrative that people can then jump into and have a strategic conversation to unlock new ideas and new insights. So that's really some of the magic behind foresight and why it's such a great tool in times of complexity and uncertainty.
Okay, I like that. So mapping complexity through story and conversation as opposed to actually drawing it. I think probably I'd try and draw it also, like draw the interconnections and interdependencies. So
Mm.
let's talk about these possible and plausible futures then. And if
Just
you have
before, oh, just
go,
before, I just want to mention on your comment, I love the fact that you wanted to draw the system. I'm a
yeah.
systems designer as well, and I like to map archetypal patterns of systems to understand where it's going. And there's a lot of different advanced diagnostics that you can do with systems. And it can give you great insights as you are understanding the broader environment that can feed into a scenario session with strategic conversations. So that is possible. It just depends how much time and how much how much time and how much expertise your team has in order to understand those patterns, to
Mm.
diagnose them, know what they mean. But they're
But
very helpful.
you mentioned archetypal patterns. So I work a lot with leadership archetypes. I'm curious about what are some systems archetypal patterns that you see?
The most common one is shifting the burden. So what that means is it feeds into our cognitive bias where we favor short-term rewards over long-term gains. And so what it means is oftentimes when there is an issue, there's a crisis, we are looking for that quick fix in the moment to kind of address the issue, but we're not actually addressing the underlying root cause. We're shifting that underlying issue, that root cause to the future for
Mm.
someone else to decide. And so it becomes a series of quick fix and we're shifting the burden. So that's a real popular one. And the other one that I see a lot is growth and underinvestment, which is a performance archetype, which means that if there's a lot of change happening in the broader environment, there's a lot of growth in, say, I use a lot of examples of environmental and social changes because I do a lot of work in climate futures. And so if you see a lot of patterns of change, but you're itself as an organization aren't adapting to that change in real time, what happens is that there may be an underinvestment of any kind of adaptation or ability, or approaches to
Mhm.
address that shifting landscape until you become quite disrupted. And then you need to really, react fast. You need to pivot perhaps very strongly, or, it depends. So where I see this play out is more around performance. It could be eroding performance potentially because if the landscape is shifting and you're doing the same thing over and over again, your performance potentially could be at risk. And so that's just one other example of there's quite a few different archetypes.
Well, I
And
want to read
I'd
more. I'd
love
love to learn
archetypes.
more about this. Where can I go to find out more about archetypal patterns and systems?
So my favorite resource is by Donella Meadows, and it's
Oh,
called
yeah.
Thinking in Systems. And she's fantastic. Her work is amazing in terms of just understanding these types of patterns. And some of her books outline how to engage with the system and how to recognize the pattern as a block, as a system block, and how to release those blocks and uncover opportunities. So it's a really great exercise and systems, archetypal patterns. It does require paying attention and
Mhm.
to really step back and to understand, but there's so much value in doing this type of work. And it's not a common skill set that people have.
No, it is not a common skill set. And I find broadly leaders don't get a lot of education, which is interesting to me because CEOs will happily invest in their direct reports to get leadership training, but quite often those at the top haven't had leadership training, which I find surprising. And yet learning systems thinking is not often up on the higher echelons of priorities when it comes to leadership training. Usually we deal with just the fundamentals of how to set tasks, how to project management, which is more management than leadership,
Right.
and dealing with delegation and collaboration, that kind of thing, which are all essential. Doing the big
Yeah,
picture strategy work is an advanced leadership skill, and I find it is not that common, as you say. All right. Well, thank you
yeah.
for that resource. Can
You're
we
welcome.
talk about possible and plausible futures? Are they different, possible and plausible futures?
Well, slightly different. So
Okay.
plausible, it's different degrees of uncertainty essentially, and it's not so precise because anytime we talk about the future, and we talk about future time horizons, content information is less concrete and more abstract, so there is more uncertainty naturally. But when we talk about plausible futures, what we're talking about are things that could happen, right? So it's based on our understanding of what is changing in the environment, how things are evolving, how things might intersect and come together. And it's understanding those intersections of what it can potentially create in terms of plausible future. So it's things that we haven't experienced today. We have no prior knowledge of how those things may interact, but we can anticipate that we can see the potentiality of it happening. So that's more in the plausibility space where we're basing it on system patterns and we are extrapolating from there and asking what if.
Mhm.
So there is a degree of uncertainty. It's not a forecast, but it is based on actual information about what we're observing in the patterns of the system today. When we
Can
talk
we,
about,
sorry,
yes,
that was a natural pause that I jumped in on. Go for it.
it's okay. I was just going to say, in contrast to possible scenarios, sometimes possible scenarios adds more degree of uncertainty because we're talking about maybe longer time horizons, and it allows us to explore and be creative in different ways. But it does not mean that there might be sometimes a disconnection from what's happening today. Depends on who is the methodology that's being used and what people want to explore in that possible future scenario. It might even be used to fuel innovation. This is where science fiction scenarios are used a lot, where they really push the limits and challenge people's assumptions and really think really differently about different technologies and different ways of using it. So that's just one example of like possible, where it's you know, it's still, there's a lot of distance between today and that world, but it's meant to take you in a different space and a different way of thinking.
Well, I'm a sci-fi writer, so I like testing the possible and expanding awareness and as well as testing assumptions. I like all of that. Do you have an example of a client that you might have worked with recently where you did this kind of work, just to give us a bit of a tangible taste of what this could look like for someone?
So a lot of the work that I do in futures focuses on the plausible.
Hmm.
A lot of my clients are more interested in that space because they're very interested in strategic conversations. They want to know how things are evolving and what are the potential disruptions on the horizon.
Hmm.
So it's again not forecasting, but it's understanding the evolution. So my one of my most favorite projects that I was involved with around plausible scenario creation was for the Canadian Forces College. This was a few years ago. And it was a 5-day exercise with a syndicate of 12 lieutenant colonels. And our task was to understand the Arctic landscape from a security perspective and to map out what's changing in the landscape. And then to also develop 4 plausible scenarios that we can use to generate strategic conversations to start to unpack new insights for our national defense strategy. So it was a big ask and it was very intense. And to do that in 5 days, you have to really be able to frame your system and be very focused on what you want to explore. So it
Can you
took
explain that a little bit more about what do you mean by frame the system?
frame the system. So basically, the first rule of systems thinking is know your boundaries
Okay.
of what you're going to explore and what you're not going to explore. And especially if you have a time constraint, you want to really at least draw that boundary of what's in scope and what's out of scope. So this way you can contain your process of inquiry. And the reason for that is simply because when you are scanning a system, an open-ended system, you could be scanning forever.
Hmm.
There's tons of information. There's endless different perspectives and different things you can learn, go down, and explore. So you need to put some sort of boundary where it's open, but it's a little bit closed so that you can explore. And if there's something that you've identified through your work that you're like, oh, that's an important piece, we need to expand the boundary, you can do that. And so it's bringing in first principles thinking in a sense because you really want to focus on some of the core elements and then understand and then expand out if needed.
So
So the way
can you give
Mhm.
it like let's bring it back to the Arctic example. What were some example of boundaries or focus that you put on that?
So we were trying to determine how we wanted to put the boundary around this because Arctic policy, Arctic issues are really complex. And so what we did was we decided to do a threat risk vulnerability assessment. And the reason we chose to do this, which is a forecasting exercise a little bit, the reason we did this is because this was the information that our syndicate, our lieutenant colonels knew really well. So what we did is we did that And we identified from there the top risks, vulnerabilities, threats, but we didn't want to necessarily work from the specific risk threat. We wanted to understand what security category that belonged to. Right. So what we did is we use it as a tool to understand the four top security categories, right? And that became the boundary of what that we framed the Arctic and did deep dives. So we explored border security, economic security, environmental security, and human security, and it allowed us to put a boundary and go deep with each category and then start to ask different questions, understand the current landscape, what's changing, potential disruption, things like that, and then bring the pieces together. So it was a really excellent exercise because it showed the power of when you're in complex systems, the need sometimes to draw that boundary in
Mm.
order to go deeper with your insights and your work.
Even so, that sounds quite comprehensive. Is there something that you can give me as an example that was out of scope that you didn't consider deliberately?
For that particular project,
Yeah.
oh my. What we didn't talk about in that particular one was directly the geopolitics.
Yeah, okay. Do you wish you
Economic.
had now?
Probably. We know geopolitics is part of it, and I think it was tied indirectly to the economic and the
Okay.
border, but it wasn't necessarily, we didn't address it head on in terms of geopolitical relationships, that kind of dimension, or, foreign, you know, any kind of changes to foreign policy due to geopolitics. So, and it wasn't so much that it was an oversight more than it was a time constraint. So we decided to have that lens in the background of all of the scenarios, but certainly you could make that a focal point, right? Because then it will bring up different questions.
Well, I think if you
That
were doing it now, that would not be excluded, I'm guessing.
Oh no, not at all. You couldn't. You
Yeah.
couldn't exclude it. It would be part of every probably scenario and conversation.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying all that. So we've got the containers and boundaries around our defining the system or framing the system. And then what do we do?
So once you do that, you're really then looking at what's changing. So this is the anticipatory thinking that we've been talking about. And so there's the systems, understanding what's happening in the systems, but it's also then looking at weak signals of change. And so weak signals of change is a little different from systems and system emergence. It's really the consequences of these changes. What are some new emerging issues that are happening that we've never experienced before? And how can those potentially cascade? And how could they intersect with other elements? So this is where you're trying to develop a horizon scan of what is happening broadly in the system across a lot of different categories, and you're making sense of these patterns, and you're also identifying the uncertainty, which is also very helpful because most organizations, they don't necessarily work with uncertainty directly. They tend to do a lot of risk assessments, which is all about reducing uncertainty. But if you map where the uncertainty is, it allows for you to have a different conversation and to explore it. And so it's a different mindset when you start to go into foresight work or scenarios, because you're starting to get curious and you're starting to explore those areas of uncertainties, and you're asking different questions around what if?
Mhm.
What if this were to happen? What would that mean for my organization or for the work that I do or how we operate? So these are just a couple of the questions that can unfold when you do this type of work.
And that leads directly into looking at risk. The what if, what if this happens? What does this mean for us? Is a way of asking risk question. Is it
You,
then a separate process to look at risk and managing risk? Is that sort of like down the track piece once you've done the possible and plausible futures?
You can. So when you create those plausible and possible futures, you want to have those strategic conversations. And so part of those strategic conversations, you want to curate those questions so that you can, you know, have the conversation on things you're looking to learn. But one of those could be potential future risk. You could ask that question in this scenario, what are new risks that we haven't encountered before? What are the potentiality? You're not necessarily quantifying them. It's qualitative, but you're identifying things that we never considered today that might be new that we may need to think about moving into the future.
Okay. One of the things that you also mentioned earlier is this idea of bias coming into play, and it shows up in the archetypal patterns that we apply into our business. How can we surface some of our biases as we're constructing these possible and plausible futures? Because those biases, I'm guessing, will steer our conversations and our imaginings in a particular way. So how do we actually bring those up?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say that throughout an entire process of doing foresight, you should be thinking about biases at every stage because it does come up. It definitely comes up and it interferes with the ability to do foresight work because a lot of times, as I was mentioning earlier, we do favor the short-term rewards over long-term gains. So sometimes we don't even do as much foresight thinking because we don't necessarily, we're so primed and programmed for short-term thinking. But when you do move into a foresight activity, an important bias that's that you need to consider when you're having conversations is around confirmation bias.
Mhm.
So, for example, many times we will seek out sources of information that confirm our beliefs and our perspective of the world and
Mm,
what we feel needs to be done. But when you get into foresight type of scenarios and these types of strategic conversations, the idea is to bring a diverse set of people together with different background, different perspectives, different knowledge sets, and you are engaging in conversation where you're challenging assumptions and you are unpacking, belief systems, and you are, exploring different possibilities. So this is where it's the process that you want to set up to allow for that type of conversation so that you're not getting into groupthink or people relying on just confirmation bias because if you don't consider that, then the outputs of that activity might be very predictable,
mm,
right? So, but if you engage with a dynamic and diverse group, you'd be surprised with some of those tensions around some of those perspectives of the future, what new insights might come forth that you've never thought about before. So that's
mm,
that's part of setting it up for success.
mm. And I think that's really powerful. Yeah, having more brains with different backgrounds at the table is really helpful because they'll see things or have concerns that you had was nowhere on your horizon just because we're all operating from our own little universes. One of the things I like to get people to do is to test their assumptions is by first listing them. What are we saying we think is true? And then interrogating that. How do we know it's true? Do we have any evidence? Is it a truth or is it an assumption? And then that's quite powerful, actually. Um, an example of that on a leadership program I ran recently. It was an outdoor experiential program. And one of the things they were tasked to do was to find a canister. And so they're on a clue run, and the brief was you have to find this canister located at these particular coordinates. So we get to the location. I know where the canister is hidden. I know what it looks like. So I'm observing their process of trying to problem solve this activity. And they give up after 5 minutes. No, it's not here. I'm like, all right, let's test your assumptions. What do you think a canister looks like? And that was really revealing because people are like, oh, it's about the size of a box, like a large box that you would put film in or shoes in or something. Like they were thinking quite large objects.
Right.
And people had, out of the five or six of them, they had five or six imaginings about what a canister looks like. I said, what's the smallest possible canister? They're like, a pill dispenser? I'm like, yeah, okay. So you could be looking for something that's fairly large or something that's fairly small. And they're like, oh, how would that change the way that you're looking? Quite a lot. So they went and redid the search activity to find something that might be small, as opposed to just a cursory glance they thought would give them the solution. And I think that was quite revealing for all of them because they assumed that they all had the same picture in their head about what a canister looks like. Well, they thought they had one image in their head. Everybody had different images, and it was possibly something different than what they defined. That's actually quite hard to do. And it was only because an outside facilitator said that's an assumption about what a canister is. Sometimes the assumptions are so, they feel so truthful for us, we don't even think of them as an assumption. So it's quite a discipline. Do you have any tips on how to get to the heart of assumptions?
Oh, that's a good question. I think for me, I just like you, and I love that example, by the way, because I think that was a very powerful example you shared. I think for me, I also like to document and make it visible, because a lot of times assumptions are hidden, and as you said, often people don't even realize it's an assumption. They have this if image
Mm,
of what you're talking about based on what's being heard,
mm,
and so it's about making it visible. It's
mhm,
about, writing it down. It's about, once you bring it out of your mind and into, into a conversation, then or onto paper, then it allows you to ask questions because if it remains hidden, you will never know what those assumptions are that are driving someone's thinking.
mm.
And so it becomes an important part of the process. And there was another thing you said with your example that your assumptions shape how you look for things. And it's
Mm.
so true. The same applies with looking at using foresight and systems and anticipatory thinking, is if your assumption about the future or assumption about a pattern is a certain way, it's going to change the type of questions of inquiry and how you might be approaching the future
Mm.
and our perspective of the future. So definitely it's important to document it, write it down, to
One
talk
thing,
about it.
one thing that occurs to me is you could ask a question around whatever topic is, what do I believe about X topic? And that's one way to surf it. Because framing it that way, what do I believe? There's implied in that there's a number of assumptions in there. Some of them might be
Yes.
truths, you know. What do I believe about the Arctic is a starting point. And
Yeah,
then you could subcat, what do I believe about security in the Arctic? And then all of a sudden it starts to surface some of that. Um,
definitely.
okay.
Definitely.
Oh my
Beliefs,
goodness.
the
Oh,
root of our mental model. So beliefs are, yeah, there's a lot hidden in our belief structure
mm.
that's based on past experience. That's a great question to
Actually, it's
open
like,
up.
what do I believe about the future of our organization? Or what do I believe about the purpose of our organization? Um,
Mhm.
that kind of stuff. I think that's really powerful to do that because people are like, well, the world needs us, do they? You know, and I think you can start to dig into it then. Donna, I'm enjoying this conversation, but are you ready for the fast three?
I'm ready. I'm ready.
She said, sort of. Okay, number one, what is the future technology you most want right now?
That I want agentic AI. I know it's
Yes.
Ryzen, and I am so curious about it. I want to know how to use that and how to just to amplify, what I can do and how I can serve my clients better, but also be able to reduce workload in other ways so that I can focus on some of the important elements around just working with clients and having more creative and strategic conversations.
Yeah, I love that. I can't wait for that too. Let it be simple. Don't make it complex to implement.
No.
All right, number two, what is the best tip you ever got for leadership?
The best tip to have a learning mindset.
Mm.
And I find that this is something that is so important for today. with all of the disruption and uncertainty in the world is to approach with, wanting to learn and ask questions and recognizing that it's a continuous process of learning and unlearning and relearning. And that will keep you focused on the growth and change.
Awesome. And number three, what are you reading or listening to right now?
So I am reading a lot these days on the future of the landscape of security. So this is public safety and security. I'm working on a few projects that's intersecting topics around public safety and looking into the future. And so I'm researching and reading a lot of work these days on all of the different moving parts and what it could mean for us as a society and for organizations going forward.
Do you read a lot of spy thrillers in relationship to that?
I would like to read more. I tend to read more research articles and reports, and but I want to read more of the science fiction and spy because I feel that's going to tap into more of a different side
Uh-huh.
of my creativity and my imagination, and so I'm definitely making more time for that.
Do you have any particular author that you're eyeballing in terms of you might be interested in reading their work?
Not at the moment. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, it depends. If you want to go environmental, like somebody who's on my horizon, well, there's two. There's Neil Stevenson. His work is pretty amazing. And there's plenty of intersection of global politics, security, environmentalism there. And Kim Stanley Robinson is another one in that genre, which is the environmental geopolitical futures. So those
Does that
two.
mean future? It's
What's that?
Kim Stan, Ministry of
Kim
the Future.
Stanley Robinson. Yeah, he wrote Ministry of the Future. Yep.
I have that book.
It's a
I've
terrible
been wanting.
book. The ideas are amazing. The story is
Okay.
terrible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I started reading it and I was a little bit, it just, the structure,
Ugh.
it was what I was expecting. And I've had to restart. And
Oh
okay.
God, it's dreadful. Like, yeah, it's not an enjoyable book to read, but the ideas are fantastic. So
Okay.
yeah, if you persevere with the his terrible characterization and poor character development and persevere through that, the ideas are quite interesting. So yeah, his his other
No.
stories are better. I think like he had the Mars trilogy, which I found quite good. It's same application of character development. Like they're all kind of not very nice people. So he doesn't have very lovable characters. Let's put it that
Oh,
way, but his ideas are interesting.
good to know. Yeah, definitely have to, especially the Mars trilogy. That fascinates me because I've been more curious about space in the
Yeah.
last few years.
Well, it's quite interesting. Like the whole idea behind that, it's the terraforming applied to Mars and all the development of the society as Mars goes through terraforming, going from the red desert into this planet full of oceans. Um, so yeah. Anyway, it's all good. And that was the not so fast three. I hijacked that one. We're talking about fiction at the end. All right, Donna, we've been through a lot. Are there any questions, or is there a question I haven't asked that you'd love to answer?
Well, we've covered a lot of territory.
Yeah.
I think we've covered some of the main things that your audience probably is curious about with respect to foresight and futures. But I would probably leave with this one, thought that it's, the future is, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's perfectly okay if you feel, a little bit anxious, but it's leaning into the curiosity and, recognizing it's an opportunity to learn.
Mm.
And with every type of situation like this, yes, things are disrupted. Certain things are going to fall away that are no longer a fit, but there's also new opportunities. And so I would encourage your audience to, really search for those new opportunities and explore ways that you can adapt to the changing landscape.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. Donna, where can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
So you can reach me on my website, purplecompass.ca. And we have a variety of different services under what we call the Future Intelligence Lab, where it supports different leaders and organizations that want to explore futures literacy, anticipatory thinking, whether you're starting from a beginner or if you really want to explore and develop all the way to mastery. So it has something for everyone, no matter what stage you're at. So feel free to take a look at it and send me an email if you are interested.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Donna. This was fabulous. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
On Read to Lead this week, I am concurring with Donna and recommending Donella Meadows' Thinking in Systems. Thinking in Systems. One of the best way to accelerate your leadership capability is to learn how to think in systems. And using systems thinking technologies and strategies like are outlined in Danella's book, you can learn to map complexity more easily, to decipher something that's big and complex into something readable, digestible, manageable, dissectable, a lot of bubbles there. So that is the book I recommend for you this week, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. That's it for the show this week. The main takeaway is please join the campaign. Sign up for Power Games, a leader's guide to office politics and drama-free collaboration. The Kickstarter campaign is well underway. Don't miss out on the special offers there, the discounted rates on my workshops, the special opportunity for consultations, as well as seeing how somebody crowdsources a big book like this. And I do hope you support the campaign. Love to get this information, this book and all its resources into your hot little hands. In the meantime, live with grace, lead in service. Live well, lead well.